April 7, 1943. The sun rose pale and metallic over the Pacific horizon, its light spilling across the runways of a Japanese-held airfield like a curtain over a stage. Pilots in pressed uniforms leaned against their aircraft, cigarettes smoldering between their fingers, voices low but tinged with the arrogance of confidence. Rumors had spread of a new American fighter entering the war, a machine whispered to be sleek but fragile, fast perhaps, but untested in the deadly calculus of combat. The Japanese called it a toy, dismissing it with the same ease they once dismissed the pilots who flew lumbering American bombers into their skies. Laughter carried across the tarmac, and one young flyer compared the so-called Mustang to a paper kite with a motor strapped to its belly. Another said it looked more like a racing car than a warplane, built for sport rather than blood. Their words weren't just bravado. They came from men who had flown the A6M0, the pride of Japan, an aircraft that danced in the air like a swallow and had humbled opponents across Asia and the Pacific. For them, dominance in the sky was already settled, and the Zero was the final word. Yet beneath the surface of their confidence lay the seeds of a conflict they could not yet imagine. Across the ocean, in factories in California and hangars in Britain, engineers and pilots were already reshaping what the Mustang meant. But in this moment, in that spring of 1943, the narrative belonged to the Japanese pilots who chuckled over rumors of a machine they thought incapable of challenging their supremacy. To understand why they scoffed, one must understand what they had seen until now. American aircraft had been sturdy but blunt, machines like the P-40 Warhawk that struggled against the Zero's agility, or bombers that lumbered through the sky, easy prey for disciplined Japanese formations. The Americans fought bravely, but in the cockpit-to-cockpit duels that defined honor and mastery, the Zero had written the early chapters of the war. The central character in this unfolding drama was not one man, but two machines, the A6M0 and the P-51 Mustang. They embodied nations, strategies, and the clashing ideologies of war. The Zero, light, nimble, able to outturn anything thrown against it, was the product of a philosophy that prized offense and maneuverability above all else. Armor was stripped away, self-sealing fuel tanks were ignored, all in the service of speed and agility. It was a plane built for the bold, for pilots who believed in the supremacy of spirit over steel. The Mustang, in contrast, began its life humbly, almost as an afterthought. North American aviation, tasked in 1940 by the British to design a new fighter in record time, had produced an aircraft that was visually striking but hampered by an engine that choked at higher altitudes. The Allison-powered Mustang could claw and dive at low levels, but in the rarefied air where bomber escorts were needed, it faltered. It was, at first glance, exactly what the Japanese thought it was. Quick, yes, but not dangerous enough to threaten the balance of power. And so the conflict took shape not just in metal and horsepower but in perception. To the Japanese, the Mustang was evidence of desperation, another attempt by an enemy to match their sky warriors, another machine destined to fall behind the lethal curves of a Zero in the sky. But to the Americans, even in its flawed early form, the Mustang represented potential, an unfinished promise that might yet grow into something extraordinary. This tension, between laughter and determination, between dismissal and reinvention, was the opening spark of a transformation that would tilt the balance of the skies. At that airfield in 1943, one pilot, a seasoned veteran with a scar tracing the side of his jaw, stubbed out his cigarette and muttered, "Another toy from the Americans. Let them bring it." His comrades chuckled in agreement, but his words carried a quiet certainty. He had fought over Pearl Harbor, over the Philippines, over Guadalcanal. He had seen what arrogance could do, and though he laughed, there was something measured in his tone. He remembered the first time he had underestimated an American pilot and how close he had come to dying for it. Still, even his caution could not pierce the shared belief among his squadron that Japan's reign in the sky would last. Thousands of miles away, on an airstrip in England, an American pilot climbed into the cockpit of one of the first Mustangs shipped overseas. His name was not yet known beyond his unit, but his words would echo years later. "It's like sitting in a sports car," he said, gripping the stick, the canopy shining overhead. "She wants to fly fast. She wants to fight." But at that stage the fight was only potential. The Mustang had not yet faced its true tests. Engineers muttered about the engine, mechanics complained about performance above the clouds, and commanders debated whether the plane was worth the investment. Doubt hung over it, mirroring the dismissal it received from enemy lips. This was the crucible in which the narrative would forge itself. One side believed the Mustang a joke, the other believed it a promise. What neither fully understood yet was that the war in the skies was not decided by what a plane was in its first iteration, but by what it could become when necessity demanded reinvention. And necessity, by 1943, was tightening its grip on both sides. The Japanese were beginning to feel the strain of attrition, their pilots fewer, their fuel supplies strained, their industry struggling under bombardment. The Americans, in contrast, were accelerating, their factories pouring out steel, their engineers rethinking designs at breakneck pace. The Mustang sat at the intersection of those realities, dismissed in one corner of the world, honed in another. The first whispers of what it could become had already begun. British engineers, always quick to tinker, looked at the Allison engine and shook their heads. They imagined something greater, something worthy of the frame's aerodynamic elegance. But that was still ahead. In April 1943, the Mustang remained a shadow, its reputation defined more by ridicule than respect. And yet, shadows have a way of growing longer, creeping over the confident until they find themselves enveloped. As the day waned on that Japanese airfield, the laughter faded into routine drills. Pilots strapped into cockpits, engines roared, the smell of fuel filled the air. They prepared for missions against enemies they still believed they could outfly and outfight. None of them could imagine that within 2 years, those same skies would be patrolled by the very machine they mocked, and their laughter would echo hollowly against memories of what once was. History, indifferent to arrogance, was already shifting. The toy was waiting to bare its teeth. And so the stage was set, a plane dismissed, a rival still supreme, a war tightening like a noose. The conflict was no longer just about who ruled the skies, but about who understood the future when it was still hidden beneath ridicule. The Mustang, underestimated and overshadowed, was already writing the first line of its legacy. And when the Japanese pilots looked skyward again, what they would see would not be the kite they mocked, but the hunter they feared. The Mustang's second life began not on a battlefield but in the quiet, methodical world of design tables and test flights. Engineers in Britain had looked at the P-51's sleek fuselage and realized that the heart of the machine was holding it back. The Allison engine, capable in low-altitude combat, faltered when the air thinned and battles climbed into the realm of bombers and high-flying interceptors. It was a fighter that wanted to be more but had been shackled by circumstance. At Rolls-Royce, minds turned to the Merlin engine, the same power plant that had kept Spitfires in the fight over Britain's skies. What if that engine were married to the Mustang's frame? It was a simple, almost daring question, but the kind of question that changes wars. The first test flights of this unlikely union were nothing short of revelation. Pilots who had flown the Allison-powered Mustang stepped down from the Merlin prototype with grins stretched across their faces. The aircraft, once hesitant above the clouds, now roared into the heights with confidence. Its speed leapt past 430 miles per hour, its climb sharper, its endurance more reliable. The Mustang's frame had always been aerodynamic brilliance, laminar flow wings, a fuselage designed like a blade, but now it had the lungs to match. The joke, the toy, was becoming something altogether different. What had once been dismissed by enemies and doubted by allies began to draw a new kind of respect. One American pilot, Captain James Browning, recalled his first time pushing the Merlin-powered Mustang into a climb over the English countryside. "It was as if she had been waiting all along," he said. "Before you had to coax her, feel her limits. Now, she just wanted to go higher, faster, and she did it like it was nothing at all. For men like Browning, the transformation was not only technical but personal. They had spent months watching comrades struggle to escort bombers over Germany, their planes lacking the range or the ceiling to stay with the heavy bombers all the way to their targets. They had watched bombers cut to pieces by German fighters once the escorts had to turn back. The sky over Europe was littered with the wreckage of B-17s and B-24s, their missions measured in lives lost. To sit in a Mustang that could finally bridge that gap was to feel the weight of responsibility shift. It was no longer about surviving an underperforming machine, it was about mastering one that might finally give them the edge. The transformation of the Mustang created its own central conflict, not between pilots in the air just yet, but between expectation and reality within the Allied command. Some still hesitated, doubting whether a machine so new could be relied upon for the most critical missions. The RAF tested it, the USAF debated, commanders compared it to Spitfires and Thunderbolts. But for the men who flew it, the argument ended the moment they opened the throttle. They spoke with conviction, carrying the tone of those who had tasted what others only theorized. And their voices began to spread through the ranks. This was the fighter that could carry the bombers to Berlin and back. This was the machine that could turn the skies from death traps into corridors of power. On the ground, mechanics grew protective of their Mustangs, polishing their sleek skins, running hands along the wings as if touching something alive. They had seen planes before, durable, dependable but often crude. The Mustang, they said, was different. Its howl, the piercing whine of air through its radiator scoop, was unlike any other. Some found it eerie, others found it exhilarating, but none forgot it. The sound became its signature, a call that heralded its presence long before the silhouette appeared against the horizon. The Germans would later come to dread it, and the Japanese too, in the vast Pacific. But in these early days of 1943 and 1944, the sound was still new, still strange, like the first notes of a symphony not yet understood. The men who flew the Zero far across the Pacific had not yet faced this new incarnation. They still spoke of the Mustang with derision, dismissing the reports filtering back from Europe as exaggerations or propaganda. Their conflict remained with the Hellcats and Corsairs, tough American fighters that could slug it out but lacked the elegance of the Zero's dance. And so the divide grew wider. On one side, a plane reborn, its pilots discovering just how lethal it could be. On the other, adversaries still anchored in old perceptions, blind to the storm preparing to cross oceans. Yet conflict was not only between machines or nations, but within the hearts of the men themselves. Browning admitted in a letter home that he felt both exhilaration and dread. "We finally have the wings we prayed for," he wrote. "But that means we will be sent deeper, longer, further than before. And that means more of us may not come home." For all its speed and power, the Mustang did not erase the reality of war. It sharpened it. Now there was no excuse not to push further into enemy skies, no reason not to press the attack. The pilots knew what that meant. Confidence was tempered with fear, and yet the desire to test this new machine against the enemy burned hotter than hesitation. There was irony in how quickly the Mustang's reputation shifted. What had been a toy was now spoken of as a thoroughbred. British commanders nicknamed it the long-legged Guardian, and American airmen called it the Cadillac of the skies. The language revealed more than pride. It revealed a transformation in belief. Machines can inspire faith, and the Mustang began to do just that, reshaping the way men thought about the air war. The conflict of perception had begun to tilt in its favor. But true vindication would not come from tests or nicknames. It would come when the Mustang met its enemies head-on and proved itself in fire. By late 1943, plans were forming. Mustangs would be sent deeper into German territory, accompanying the bomber streams that had suffered so much. The crews who flew the lumbering fortresses looked up at the slivers of silver beside them and felt a new kind of reassurance. If the Mustangs stayed, if they could fight their way all the way to the heart of the Reich, then maybe, just maybe, survival was possible. One bomber pilot described it simply: when the Mustangs appeared, the air felt lighter. That single sentence captured what statistics could not: an emotional shift, a sense that fate was no longer stacked entirely against them. But the test would not remain confined to Europe. Word of the Mustang's performance began to echo across command channels in the Pacific. The war there was shifting, and the need for long-range escorts over the vast ocean was pressing. The Japanese still dismissed it, but the Americans were preparing to send it east. The stage was broadening, the actors ready. The central conflict, between arrogance and adaptation, between old dominance and new supremacy, was moving toward its inevitable collision. As one British engineer remarked while watching a Merlin-powered Mustang vanish into the clouds, "We've built something that will not just fly. It will rule." Those words, confident but understated, hinted at the truth. The Mustang was no longer a toy. It was a blade, sharpened and waiting, and soon it would be unsheathed where laughter still lingered. The moment of reckoning was coming, and the skies would never sound the same again. The Pacific War had entered its most punishing phase by early 1944, and the men who once laughed at American fighters were beginning to sense a shift in the skies. Japanese pilots, once untouchable in their nimble Zeros, now found themselves staring at silhouettes that did not belong to the Hellcats or Corsairs they had grudgingly learned to respect. These new shapes carried themselves with speed and endurance that unsettled even the most seasoned aces. The P-51 Mustang had crossed the oceans, and with it came a new chapter of aerial conflict, one where arrogance collided headlong with an evolved predator. For the Japanese, the central question was no longer whether the Zero could dominate but whether it could even survive. On the tarmac of Iwo Jima, before the island was engulfed in flames, Lieutenant Hiroshi Takeda sat beneath the wing of his fighter, wiping oil from his hands. He was a man of 24, already considered a veteran, with 30 combat missions behind him and a reputation for precision gunnery. To his younger comrades he was a mentor, the voice that assured them the Zero remained the master of the skies. Yet privately he carried a gnawing unease. Reports had begun to filter back from the Marianas. Encounters with American planes that dived faster, climbed higher, and seemed to have a bottomless thirst for pursuit. The word Mustang had reached his ears, the same name they once mocked. He did not laugh now. He wondered what kind of machine could make pilots return silent, their confidence dimmed. On the other side of the ocean, Captain James Browning, the same pilot who had once compared the Merlin-powered Mustang to a sports car, was now leading escort missions over the Pacific. He had lost friends to the long, brutal campaigns in Europe, and now he carried the weight of expectation into a new theater. Browning understood the stakes. The bombers heading toward Japan's strongholds needed guardians that could stay with them for hours, crossing the wide and unforgiving seas. The Mustang had been chosen because it could carry fuel tanks that stretched its reach to Tokyo and back. For Browning, it was not merely about protecting machines of steel and rivets. It was about ensuring the men inside those bombers would see another sunrise. Each time he took his squadron up, he remembered the wreckage of unescorted bombers he had seen littering the European fields, and he swore not to let the Pacific repeat that tragedy. The conflict between Takeda and Browning was not personal. They had never seen each other's faces, never exchanged words, but it embodied the collision of two philosophies. Takeda had been raised on the belief that agility and courage could overcome heavier, less graceful opponents. Browning flew in a machine that embodied endurance and versatility, one that could fight on its own terms rather than the enemy's. When their squadrons finally met above the blue expanse of the Philippine Sea, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The first clash was brief but decisive. Japanese Zeros, attempting to dive on a formation of B-29s, were intercepted by Mustangs that did not turn away when the battle rose higher. Takeda, leading the charge, pulled his Zero into a tight spiral, expecting to shake his pursuers as he had done countless times before. But when he glanced over his shoulder, the silver plane remained glued to his tail, climbing with him, refusing to fall away. His heart pounded as realization struck. This was not the lumbering foe he had mocked. The Mustang could match his every move, and worse, it had the armor and firepower his fragile Zero lacked. He broke away, firing bursts, but the Mustang's pilot rolled effortlessly, answering with a salvo that tore into the wing of another Zero in Takeda's formation. The fight ended with smoke trailing across the sky, and Takeda landed hours later with a hollow silence pressing against his chest. Browning, after that mission, wrote a note in his logbook. They tried their spirals, their dives, their turns. We stayed with them. The toy has grown teeth and it bites hard. His squadron had downed 6 enemy fighters for the loss of none. The numbers told a story that words could not soften. From that day forward, encounters with Mustangs became etched in Japanese diaries, not with laughter but with despair. Pilots who once boasted of invincibility now admitted they faced an enemy they could not outlast. One diary, later recovered from a downed pilot, read, "The Mustang does not tire. Follows like a shadow. Even when we dive, it dives faster. Even when we climb, it climbs higher. Our Zero is no longer master. We are hunted." Those words, stark and unembellished, reflected a shift that no propaganda could conceal. Yet the conflict was not only mechanical, it was human. Takeda found himself staring at his reflection in a small mirror, wrestling with pride and survival. Could he still tell his younger comrades that the Zero was supreme, knowing what he had seen? His honor demanded confidence, but his eyes had witnessed the truth. Each mission deepened his conflict as more friends failed to return, victims of silver planes that howled like banshees through the skies. The Mustang was no longer rumor. It was a predator, and he, once hunter, now felt the role of prey pressing down on him. For Browning, the Mustang's dominance brought no joy, only a somber duty. He respected the skill of the men he fought, men like Takeda who pressed their fragile machines into impossible battles out of loyalty and courage. After one particularly brutal escort, he confessed to his wingman, "They're fighting with ghosts. Brave men in dying machines. But if we don't stop them, more of our boys will burn in those bombers." His respect did not weaken his resolve, it sharpened it. He knew that sympathy could not be allowed to dull the edge of survival. As months passed, the statistics grew heavier. Kill ratios widened. By late 1944, Mustangs and their pilots had established themselves as the most feared escorts in the Pacific. The central conflict crystallized, a new reality pressing against an old belief. For Japan, the Zero had been not just a plane but a symbol of national spirit, proof that willpower and ingenuity could overcome material disadvantage. To admit its inferiority was to admit something deeper, that the tide of the war itself was turning. Still, Takeda flew not because he believed in victory but because duty bound him to the sky. Each time he lifted off, he carried the ghost of his earlier laughter, a memory of mocking the very machine that now haunted his every mission. Browning, too, continued, his resolve steeled not by triumph but by necessity. The Mustang was proving itself not only against the Zero but against the very idea that Japan could dictate the terms of air combat. When Takeda and Browning's squadrons clashed once more in early 1945, the outcome was already written in the evolving story of the skies. Takeda returned with bullet holes stitched across his fuselage, his survival a fragile gift. Browning landed with quiet determination, his thoughts not on victory but on endurance. The conflict between them would never be resolved in a single dogfight. It was resolved in the slow grind of attrition, in the shift from laughter to silence, in the acceptance that the toy had become a ruler of the air. The skies over the Pacific were no longer a stage for mockery. They had become an arena where every myth was tested, and only truth remained. The Mustang had forced that truth upon its enemies, and men like Takeda bore its weight. Browning, for his part, knew the story was not yet finished. The final reckoning still lay ahead, not only in the Pacific but across the collapsing fronts of a world war. The silence after each battle was louder than the engines themselves, a silence that carried the echo of laughter turned hollow. And as 1945 dawned, both sides understood. The conflict was not just about who controlled the skies. It was about who could accept that the future no longer belonged to the past. The winter of 1945 stretched long and merciless across the Pacific, and with it came the final harrowing evolution of the conflict between men and machines, belief and reality. The P-51 Mustang now roamed farther than any American fighter before it, its silver wings gleaming above islands scarred by fire and oceans thick with the memory of wreckage. For the Japanese pilots who once dismissed it, the laughter had long since vanished, replaced by a silence heavy with resignation. Yet within that silence still stirred men like Lieutenant Hiroshi Takeda, who clung to duty as a drowning man clings to driftwood, and men like Captain James Browning, who carried the weight of victory not as triumph but as burden. Their stories, parallel yet never converging in face or word, embodied the truth of a war's climax, the meeting of pride and inevitability in skies that belonged to no man. Takeda had survived longer than most. His squadron, once full of eager voices, had thinned until only a handful remained, their eyes hollowed by fatigue. Each sortie became an act of ritual, the bow before the aircraft, the whispered promise to ancestors, the tightening of straps with hands that trembled though they would never admit it aloud. He no longer believed the Zero was invincible. He had seen too many friends fall, their fragile planes shredded by Mustangs that dove with unrelenting ferocity. Yet still he flew, not out of faith in victory but out of duty to those who had already given everything. His central conflict was no longer with the Americans who chased him across the clouds, but with himself, the pride of a warrior wrestling against the quiet knowledge of defeat. Browning, by contrast, carried the weight of momentum. Each mission he led stretched the Mustang's endurance further, escorting B-29 bombers that thundered toward Japan's industrial heart. The stakes had grown beyond single battles. These missions carved at the very capacity of Japan to wage war. He knew the risks, had seen bombers swallowed by flak and fighters vanish in fireballs, but he also knew the balance had shifted irreversibly. The Mustang was not only a fighter now, it was a guardian, a symbol that the tide had turned. Yet for Browning, victory tasted of ash. He respected his enemies too much to gloat, and the sight of desperate Japanese sorties, brave men hurling themselves in machines they knew were outmatched, haunted him. He fought not with hatred but with a grim determination to see the war end, to send his men home alive, to close the chapter. The climax of their parallel paths came in the spring, when Browning's squadron was tasked with escorting bombers over Tokyo itself. It was the mission that symbolized everything: the long reach of American power, the final unraveling of Japan's air defense, and the full maturity of the Mustang's legacy. The morning air was sharp, the ocean below endless, and the bombers lumbered ahead like titans vulnerable to the slings of desperate foes. Browning flew slightly above them, scanning the horizon, his eyes narrowed against the sun's glare. His men were silent over the radios, each one waiting for the inevitable swarm of interceptors that would rise to meet them. Takeda was among those interceptors. His Zero rattled in protest as he lifted off, its engine coughing like an old man's lungs, its frame patched more times than he could count. Around him, fewer planes than before struggled into the air, each piloted by men who already knew they were flying toward death. He looked at their faces as they taxied, saw the same mixture of fear and duty etched into their expressions. Once they would have cheered each other with boasts, but now words seemed too heavy to lift. Takeda swallowed hard and told himself one thing only: he would not falter. If he must fall, it would be with honor. The clash came swiftly. Mustangs streaked downward from high altitude, diving with the shriek of predators. Bombers thundered overhead, their bellies bristling with guns, while flak blossomed like black flowers against the pale sky. Takeda pulled his Zero into a climb, angling toward the bombers, and for a heartbeat he felt the old exhilaration of the hunt. But then he saw them, the silver planes sliding into his path, moving with a speed and grace that made his stomach tighten. One broke toward him, its guns already flashing. He rolled hard, metal groaning, and slipped past the first burst, but the Mustang followed, climbing with him, refusing to let go. Browning was in that Mustang. His eyes locked onto the fragile silhouette before him, noting its agility, the way it twisted like a swallow, but he knew the Zero's limits now. He stayed patient, matching every maneuver, closing the gap inch by inch. His guns roared again, bullets shredding the air around Takeda's plane. Browning did not feel triumph. He felt the pull of inevitability, the knowledge that he had become the hand of a future the other man could not escape. Takeda's plane shuddered, holes tearing through the wing. He coughed smoke, forced the stick forward, dove toward the clouds in a desperate gamble. The Mustang followed, merciless. His heart pounded, not with fear but with the bitter taste of understanding. This was what he had once mocked, what he had once dismissed as a toy. Now it was the shadow at his back, the executioner he could not outfly. In that moment the conflict within him resolved. Pride gave way to clarity. He was not failing because he lacked skill, but because history itself had shifted beneath his wings. Browning's final burst tore across the Zero's tail, and Takeda's plane spiraled downward, trailing fire. For an instant, Browning imagined the man inside, the face he would never see, the eyes that had once laughed at the word Mustang. He whispered under his breath, "Forgive me," and pulled up, watching the fireball bloom below. The bombers droned on, their path clear. The mission continued, but in that fiery descent, the conflict of two men reached its climax. Takeda's comrades returned in dwindling numbers, their losses impossible to ignore. Browning's squadron landed hours later, engines hissing, men exhausted but alive. Neither side spoke of victory with joy. For the Japanese, survival was a hollow word. For the Americans, victory was simply endurance until the war's bitter end. Yet within that silence, one truth resonated. The Mustang had fulfilled its destiny. It had crossed oceans, shattered myths, and turned ridicule into fear. The story of the toy had become the story of dominance, and the men who lived through it bore its mark forever. For Takeda, his final thoughts were carried down in smoke, the realization that bravery alone could not defy inevitability. For Browning, his burden remained in the memory of eyes he never met, men he had outflown not out of hate but out of necessity. The conflict between them, faceless yet deeply human, was the very essence of war. And when silence settled over the airfields that night, the laughter that once echoed there was gone forever. The Mustang had ruled the skies, and history had sealed its legacy.